good morning. You ever heard the saying before that location is everything? Well, advertisers will tell you that the difference between an advertising campaign that works and an advertising campaign that doesn't work usually has everything to do with where you put it. And here's a couple of examples of this. Now, this was an ad for Yahoo that was put in the baseball field that the Seattle Mariners play in. And one person is laughing because that individual gets it. But you might not catch this immediately, but beside the Yahoo sign is a 404-foot marker, meaning that that wall is actually 404 feet from the plate. The funny thing is that 404 is also a common internet error code that you get when your search engine can't find the web page that you're looking for, right? So this Yahoo ad wouldn't have been so funny if it had been put in a different location. This next ad is actually for an insurance company, and I know you can't read what's on the bus here, but it's a slogan that's plastered on the side of the bus, and it says, if you don't have GIO third-party property insurance, we suggest you don't hit this bus. It's kind of funny because a car has obviously hit that bus. Well, this next one, it was actually deemed that the boards on this professional hockey rink was the best place to put this company advertising. And I'm sure as you'd agree, location is everything, right? In real estate, they will also tell you this, that location is everything. If you've ever been in the process of buying a house before, then you know that you can have the identical house in two separate areas of the city, and the difference is tens of thousands of dollars because location matters. Monica and I were recently involved in the building of a water well in a very impoverished part of Kenya, and one of the things that we learned along the way was that the difference between digging a water well here and digging a water well just a few yards away over here can mean the difference between getting a little bit of water and getting a whole lot of water. We learned that location really is everything. Well, this principle is also true in the art of war. And today we're going to continue with our Hero series, and we're going to look at the story of a gentleman by the name of Joshua, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with. We're given a very brief snapshot of this this hero in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30, where we're told, by faith the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. And of course, this is referring to the faith of a man that we very often think of as being a great leader and a great military strategist. And his name was Joshua. What we're about to learn about in this story is that the nation of Israel taking the city of Jericho, it had everything to do with its location and its strategic importance to the promised land that God had promised to give to the nation of Israel. As it related to Jericho, location really was everything. You know, one of the first principles of war is that if you want to conquer a people group or an area, it's essential that you discover and overthrow the enemy's strategic strongholds. In fact, in most battles, there are certain strategic geographical locations that can literally mean the difference between winning and losing the war itself. And this has played out countless times throughout history. When the Allied forces landed on the beaches of France, it was incredibly important that they identified the bunkers that the German army controlled on the coastline. And it was extremely important that they overthrew the troops who were occupying those bunkers. Once they occupied that location on those beaches, it was only then that more troops could be brought in from across the channel to France, and then they could begin to make inroads to the rest of German-occupied Europe. So while every battle to regain that occupied territory, every battle was important, there were some that were absolutely vital if the campaign was going to succeed, and that happened to be one of them. Controlling that area, that location at that moment was everything. Well, the same could be said for the city of Jericho in the story that we're going to look at this morning. And we start to look at this story in chapter 5 and 6 of the Old Testament book of Joshua. Now keep this in mind as we're working through this. It had been 40 years, almost to the day, 40 years earlier, that God had brought the nation of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. And during that time, the people went through a lot of ups and downs in their relationship with God. 40 years earlier, the nation of Israel had seen God send all the plagues on the Egyptian people. And they had seen God force Pharaoh's hand to the point where he let them all go. 40 years earlier, the nation of Israel had seen God part the Red Sea, parting the water and giving them nothing but dry land to walk on, we're told. 40 years earlier, the nation of Israel had seen God miraculously drown the entire Egyptian army that was chasing them. And 40 years from the event that we are going to look at today, the nation of Israel had seen God do all of that because it was his way of telling them that they never had to worry again about the Egyptians that were oppressing them. It was his way of telling them that he had not forgotten about them and they were still his chosen people. And it was his way of telling them that he had not abandoned them. So imagine that with me. Imagine that God had just performed all of those things and was now about to take that group of people into the promised land. And as the story is told, they refused to go. They refused to go. They complained. They doubted that God actually could give them that land. It was 40 years prior to the story that we're looking at this morning that the nation of Israel, as it's recorded in Numbers 14, chapter 14, not only did they say they weren't going to put their trust in God, but they actually said that they wanted to go back to Egypt, that life was better there than what God had provided for them. When Joshua and Caleb tried to reason with them by reminding them that that same God who had delivered them from Egypt would give them the victory over their enemies and would give them the land that he had been promising them, this passage says that the people, they wouldn't listen. And in fact, they wanted to stone Joshua and Caleb. Imagine that. So in response to that lack of faith and trust, God sent the whole nation into the wilderness for 40 years. 40 years of senseless wandering. And during that time, as a punishment, everyone who was over the age of 20 died, with the exception of 2 men, that being Joshua and Caleb. So during the 40 years in the wilderness, God continued to provide for them. In fact, he continually fed them with manna. Manna was this, as most of you know, this bread-type substance that appeared on the ground every morning and kept the people fed. It's interesting. Part of the Jewish oral tradition tells us that it actually tasted like whatever you wanted it to. In other words, there was no one who would sit down to a plate of manna and ask if there was something else to eat, because out of the 2 million people there, it could taste like something unique to everyone. So if you happen to be craving a Big Mac that morning and all you had was manna, it would taste like a Big Mac. Or Mike, if you're craving Tony Roma's ribs, it would taste like Tony Roma's ribs. Now, we don't actually know if that's true because it's not found anywhere in the Bible, but that is what's taught to Jewish kids in what would be equivalent to their Sunday school classes today. So it was coming to the end of that 40-year period when the event that we're looking at this morning takes place. And Joshua chapter 5 records what's kind of a preamble to the story, but it's essential that we grasp the significance of it. In Joshua chapter 5, starting at verse 13, we find Joshua, he's out by himself, and we're not specifically told what he's doing. But it's probably not difficult to guess. He's likely doing what good commanders are always doing before major battles. He's most likely having some big thoughts about what military strategy he was going to choose. How am I going to lead God's chosen people to victory against the giants in Jericho? And while he's having one of these deep thought moments, we're told that this happens, starting at verse 13. Now, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us, or are you for our enemies?" Now, keep in mind that Joshua is in enemy territory here, and he walks right into this guy who has a drawn sword, and he doesn't recognize him. And as soon as Joshua notices that he's even there, he's already so close that he realizes, I may have a fight on my hands. So he asks this guy what would be a very logical question, right? He says, are you for us or are you for our enemies? Or I love the way the NCV puts this. It says, are you a friend or are you an enemy? Verse 14 continues and it says, neither, he replied, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? The messenger tells him that God hasn't come to take sides, but he has come to take over. We're told in verse 15 that the commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for the place that you are standing is holy. And so Joshua did so. It's very important that we understand that Joshua was being told here that the place he was standing on, this enemy territory, was now holy ground, for it had been claimed by God himself. God was really telling Joshua that his presence was there and that the battle that he was about to lead was not something that he would be fighting alone. And with this personal encounter, we walk right into chapter 6. And this story really does represent, it signifies that the nation of Israel, who had been, again, wandering aimlessly for the last 40 years, well, that was about to change. They were about to shift from being nomads to being people who were now able to claim the land that God had promised to them. The time had come for the people of Israel to leave the desert, to leave their 40 years of wandering, and to finally leave the mistakes of their ancestors. This was in many ways a new beginning for them, and they would finally claim what God had promised them. But as God often does, even I think he does this with us too, the first thing he does is he takes them right back to where they were at the time of their first rebellion, the first time they said no. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this. But did you know that they are in almost the exact geographical location, the same spot that the previous generation had complained about and said no to God? God had brought this now new generation to the same spot that their ancestors had been in when they said no. And once again, they had a decision that they needed to make. Were they going to follow the God who had led their ancestors out of slavery, or were they going to follow the God who had kept them safe and fed them as they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years? Were they going to make the same mistakes as their ancestors did? Well, we're about to find out. And as we begin chapter 6, this is what we're told in chapter 6, verse 1. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went in, or no one went out, and no one came in. So let me give you a little bit of a background about Jericho here, because Jericho was a very important city in that day, both from a military and a religious, as well as an economic standpoint. It stood right on the border of the Promised Land, and it was really the first line of defense that any enemy of that area had to get through before it could proceed into the Promised Land. So to say that the location was everything would likely be an understatement in this case, because if the nation of Israel was going to claim the land that God had told them was rightfully theirs, it needed to start with Jericho. Because it was such an important location, the Canaanite rulers made sure that it was well protected, and it really was a fortress city with these high, thick walls, well-fortified gates, guard towers, and incredibly well-armed soldiers. The actual city of Jericho was only excavated in the 1950s, and it was discovered that the city actually had two walls. So try and picture this with me. The first wall was about 15 feet high, and it was a base of stone topped with an 8-foot brick wall about the height of a 2-story house. The second wall, built behind it, was about 15 feet back from the first and running parallel with it the whole way around the city, and it was over 30 feet high. And the two walls were joined together by these large pieces of very smooth polished stone running at an angle of 45 degrees from the lower wall to the higher. So can you picture that? So these two walls had a sloping rampart in between them for the army to stand and fight on. To top it all off, all around the wall were these huge gates, which were the only means of getting in and out of the city. And they were reinforced with these huge pieces of iron. And once firmly secured on the inside, it was virtually impossible for enemies to penetrate the city. From a military standpoint, in fact, once Jericho was closed up, it was almost impenetrable. Catapult technology didn't exist back then, so an army couldn't really break down the wall that easily. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that they really didn't have a lot of options. We're told that back then they really would have only had 4 options of how they could have gotten into the city. First, they could scale the walls using ladders or ramps. The problem with this method is that the ladders could easily be pushed over, right? And Jericho had this battalion of excellent archers, so chances are that by the time you even made it to the top, if you made it to the top, you'd likely be shot. The second thing they could have done was dug tunnels underneath, and this again was a very real option for them. But keep in mind that the sheer weight of the walls meant that you would likely be digging down somewhere between 18 to 20 feet, and it would be incredibly time-consuming. It would be labor-intensive, and the enemy could shower you with arrows as well as pouring burning hot oil on you from the wall, which was actually a very common tactic back then. The third option that they had is they could try and smash a hole in the wall or the city gates. And again, this was another valid option, but it came with risks. Just like digging underneath, it was very time-consuming, especially considering how thick and heavy the walls and the gates were. It would likely have taken months to put a hole in those walls. Well, the fourth option was simply to wait out the people. They could just wait until the people were starved into surrender, but that too was very problematic because Jericho was almost completely self-sufficient. In many ways, Jericho was considered to be an oasis in the middle of what was a very harsh desert. You know, much like Manitoba has the nickname Friendly Manitoba, Saskatchewan is the land of living skies, Nova Scotia is called Canada's ocean playground, Toronto is called the city without a hockey team. Isn't that right? Andre, did I get that right? Yeah. Jericho had a nickname too, and it was called the City of Palms because it had thousands of palm trees that grew in there. And they could grow there because of this natural water source inside the walls that provided for water for drinking, for crops, and for cattle. So they were very self-sufficient in there. The late British archaeologist Kathleen Kenton, who was the one that led the team to excavate the site in the 1950s, wrote this about Jericho. In this dazzling expanse, the oasis of Jericho stands as one would imagine the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis. And all of that was due to the presence of a natural spring called the Salton Spring that provided more than enough water to support the inhabitants. So if the nation of Israel wanted to play the waiting game with those living in the walls, they would likely lose. In fact, the people of Jericho knew that all they really needed to do was shut their gates and wait inside, and the invaders would eventually go away. The point that I'm trying to make by telling you all this is that the city of Jericho was really prepared for anything. It's interesting, though, that the first thing that we see in this chapter, the first thing we read about Jericho is that the city was shut up, or it was closed up tight because of the children of Israel. And it says that nobody went in and nobody went out. And that's telling us that the people of Jericho, even though they were safely inside the walls, they were likely afraid of the nation of Israel because of what they had heard had happened at the Red Sea and the Jordan, and because of the enormous number of people. But God said this to Joshua in verse 2. He says, "See, I have delivered or given Jericho into your hands along with its king and its fighting men." I think this is kind of a funny way to term this because I know that none of us can read Hebrew here. But the verb delivered used in this passage indicates that the battle has already been won. It's typically used in past tense when it's talking about a battle that was won way back then. The verb that God is using here, delivered in this passage, is meaning that the battle had already been won. So when the Lord said this to Joshua, it's as if he's saying, trust me, we got this one. It's already been won. God then went on to tell Joshua the brilliant military strategy that would bring them victory. And I know you'll all agree that this is likely very unorthodox, and I'm sure when Joshua heard it, he was scratching his head a little bit. But this is what God said. He said this is what he wanted Joshua and the Israelites to do. He says, march around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long trumpet blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in. Well, as a competent military specialist, I really don't know what Joshua thought about this, and it's interesting that we're really not told. But what we do know is that he wasn't prepared to lead the nation of Israel into making the same kind of mistake that they had made 40 years previous. Remember that he and Caleb were the only remaining survivors that had seen God send the plagues, that had seen God free their ancestors from the oppressors. They were the only 2 that had been there when the Red Sea parted and had seen God destroy the Egyptian army. They knew that if their God could do all of that, then dealing with these walls was really not a big deal for him. They knew that, but keep in mind that none of the other people of Israel had been a part of those great miracles. So what does Joshua do? Verse 6. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it. I absolutely love this verse because what was supposed to lead the people as they went around Jericho in silence? It was the Ark of the Covenant. And this is what sits in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. And this is a symbol that God is leading them because it's a symbol of God's very presence to the nation of Israel. What else does Joshua do in verse 7? And he ordered the army, advance, march around the city with an armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord. When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding, but Joshua had commanded the army, do not give a war cry. Do not raise your voices. Do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout. So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling at once. Then the army returned to camp and spent the night there. So keep in mind that the city of Jericho, although it was this ominous sight to see with its huge walls and gates, it actually was quite small. In fact, the circumference of the city was only about the length of 4 football fields, that's CFL football fields. So it was a very short walk around the city. So try and picture this with me. Keep in mind that at this point, the Israelites were likely about 2 million people strong. So here are all these people marching around this smaller city. Everybody, all 2 million of them. And most of the people are actually arriving back in camp before everyone else has even left the camp. And what that means is that people have to wait a long time to get their turn to march around the city. But it's important because God wants everybody involved with this. In fact, I think God wanted the people of Jericho to see what they were up against as these millions of people walked by. And to the people watching, the column after column after column of people, it would have looked endless to the people in Jericho. So why did God do that? Well, I think that one of the reasons God did this is that he wanted to move the people, the nation of Israel, from being spectators to participants. They all needed to march. They all needed to see it with their own eyes. They all needed to experience it. They all needed to play a part in what he was about to do, because this was the beginning of something new. Notice in verse 10, they're to march in absolute silence. So no singing, no chatting, no visiting with the neighbor you're walking with, no texting, no phone calls, no listening to your iPod, not a word. Verse 12, Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the second day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. So again, picture this. Day 1, they march around the city. Silently they walk. Day 2, again they march around the city and silently walk. Day 3, they march around the city and silently walk. Day 4, once more they walk, looking at the wall in anticipation of what God's going to do. Probably thinking to themselves, that is a big wall. I wonder what God is going to do. Day 5, day 6, they do the same. And finally, day 7 comes around. And they've all been told about this day. This is the day that something different is going to happen. Verse 15, on the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day, they circled the city 7 times. Some have wondered, and I choose to believe this, if this didn't allow everyone in the nation of Israel to be present, kind of like a snake coiling itself around its prey. That's what God was really doing. He was giving everybody, the whole nation of Israel, a front row seat to what he was about to do. The 7th time around, when the priest, this is verse 16, 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, shout, for the Lord has given you this city. Verse 17 to 19 of this chapter actually contain another story of a very unlikely hero that is found in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. And we're not going to take time to work through that story, but I'd encourage you to do it. It actually talks about the prostitute Rahab. But verse 20 continues. It goes on and says, when the trumpet sounded, the army shouted. And at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men, women, young, old, cattle, sheep, donkeys. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. People often comment when these type of battles occur in the Old Testament. I mean, call it what you want. This was a massacre that happened. And you seemingly have this entire group of people wiped out. People often say, I just don't understand how a loving and just God could do those kinds of things. You ever heard that before? It was the total annihilation of the people of Jericho. And some with the keen sense of justice would even say, I don't know if I could ever follow a God that would do something that horrific. Well, before you start feeling sorry for the people who lived in Jericho, you've got to realize something about who they were. When the city of Jericho was excavated in the 1950s, the British archaeologists that led the project commented on how they found all kinds of strange things actually embedded into the walls of the city. Included in what they found was what happened to be the bones of newborn babies, located right in the walls, as if the walls had been made with them. And as they continued to unearth the city, they discovered documents that talked about when the walls were built. The king at that time, as a sacrifice to their gods, took the newborn babies, 2 months and younger, and buried them alive in the walls of that fortified city. And trust me, that's not the worst thing they found out. I think that God had decided that the time had come to deal with them And on one hand, their destruction was their punishment, while on the other hand, it was God's way of destroying their influence in that area. People say, how could a loving God, how could a just God do those kinds of things? And it was likely his justice that destroyed them that day and protected the rest of the area from ever being influenced by them again. One of the other interesting things that archaeological dig discovered was that the walls of Jericho, they didn't fall outward and they didn't even fall inward. But it was as if the walls fell flat. The walls crumbled straight down, just as it says in Joshua chapter 6, verse 5. That the wall, it says this, will collapse and the army will go up and everyone will go straight in. And you know, that is exactly what the archaeological evidence shows. The walls crumbled into one big heap, not from physical pressure without, not from some physical pressure within, but the walls simply fell down so that there could be no doubt whose victory this really was. The chapter concludes in verse 27, and it says this, so the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. This is my question to you this morning. So why was it that Joshua was a hero? I want to throw 3 very quick takeaways from this story for you and I from this. And the first is that Joshua was a hero of faith, not because he said yes to God when things were making sense, but he was a hero because he believed and trusted and obeyed God when things didn't make sense. I'm sorry, but that military strategy from a human perspective didn't make a lot of sense. And there's a lot of things that happen to you and I, a lot of things that happen in our lives that we probably feel that way about too. It just doesn't make sense. And my question to you is, can you live with the fact that God really doesn't owe you an explanation? God doesn't owe you an explanation of what he is going to do or why he is going to do it. And our big question is the same question that the nation of Israel needed to answer. Can we live with that? Can we trust in a God whose character is sufficient for us to be obedient? The second takeaway, the second thing that made Joshua a hero of faith, is not because of his heroic actions, but because he understood his role in God's plan. He never took onto his portfolio or into his job those things that were actually God's responsibilities. He let God be God and understand that his role was to be God's voice to the people. In other words, he knew his role. He's remembered as a hero of faith, not for his actions, but because of his obedience. And the third thing that made Joshua a great leader was not his ability to motivate his troops, but as most Christian leaders are. What made him a great leader was that he was so sensitive to the voice of God that he heard and he obediently followed. As I was thinking about that this week as I was preparing, I found myself thinking about the number of times that maybe we hear the voice of God. Maybe it's not an audible voice. Maybe it's through some wisdom from people that we hold in high esteem. And really what it was that made Joshua such a hero of faith was that he listened and he obediently took what God was telling him and he acted on it. May God give you and I the ability to do that as well. Let's pray. God, I want to thank you for this story. And it really is a very powerful story about trust and about obedience and about how we react when things in our life just are not making sense. Father, I thank you for the example of Joshua, and I thank you for how he was willing to trust you even when he didn't understand what was happening around him. Lord, I thank you for the lessons that we can learn from that. And even in this congregation, even in this auditorium this morning, I know that there are people who are going through situations that, Father, they really don't understand. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's something else. I pray, Lord, that you would give us what Joshua had. Give us that ability to trust in what we don't understand. Give us that ability to listen, and give us the ability to be obedient to what you're asking us to do. In your name we pray. Amen.